All right. Hello, everybody. This is Kaya Rebana, co-chair of South Central Wisconsin Move to Amend. Obviously, I'm giving this webinar on messaging and earned media. And big thanks to everybody's patience given the technical difficulties last week. So for everybody who was on then and is on now, thanks for coming back. And hopefully this time we'll go without a hitch. So, there we go. Okay, so before we get started, a few participation tips. First, the participant list is on the left. You probably figured that out already, but you can see who else is here if you haven't already. If you would like to maximize your screen, there's a little square icon kind of near the top, so you can get the full experience. And if you have any questions, feel free to just type those at any time in the chat bar at the bottom. Unless they're pressing, though, we will take questions and answer them at the end, but you can put them in there anytime, and we will, Caitlin will read them back at the end, and then we'll answer them then. And finally, if you do have any technical difficulties, feel free to type your question using the chat bar. Caitlin will do her best to answer it, and if that does not work, then you can email support@anymeeting.com. A couple of announcements. First off, we have amendment language. So if anybody out there has not seen it yet, it's I think it's pretty great, and deals with corporate personhood and money not being speech, and that can be accessed at that link right there. So do check it out after the webinar if you haven't seen it yet. Also, we have a nice handy comparison of introduced amendments, which is also online. So all those amendments introduced into Congress, you can go there to kind of see what's good about them, what's bad about them, how they compare to each other, and how they compare to our proposed language. Next, there's our Occupy the Courts action, which will be a nationwide action on January 20th to mark the second anniversary of the Citizens United decision. That is actually the day before the actual anniversary, but that's because that's a Friday and therefore a business day, and therefore the courts will be open. And so all the folks who are doing actions in front of courthouses will have people coming through, so that's good. So would highly encourage you to organize an action in your own community if there isn't already one. Even if you don't have a federal courthouse, you can organize something at a local building or landmark. So there is more information at that link there. And I think we're up to, Caitlin, we're up to about half of the federal courthouses in the country, right, at this point. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, the last I heard, we were at 60, and there are just over 100.
Great. So really, really exciting, going to be a really big action. And finally, would encourage you to affiliate with Move to Amend if you have not already. So if you have a local organization, whether it's focused just on Move to Amend or it's another organization that just supports Move to Amend's goals, you can affiliate. And there's information on that process at that link right there. There's also information, by the way, if you have not yet formed a group, there's information on how to form a group kind of from the ground up, which is on our website as well. There's a blue box over at the right-hand side, right by the webinar tab, that says something like Local Action Toolkit. Caitlin, is that correct? Local Action Toolkit is what it says?
Yep, that's right.
Okay, so you can check that out too if you are still trying to get started. So tonight we're going to talk about media, and specifically earned media. First, I'll tell you what that term means, since I assume it's not going to be familiar to everybody. We're going to talk a bit about framing, talk about storytelling, give some basics about how to work with reporters, discuss newsworthiness, like whether a story is actually worth telling as news, talk about staying on message during an interview, give some tips for radio and television interviews, and finally, we'll talk about what to do if a reporter calls you. And the whole thing should probably last about an hour, maybe a little bit less, and we'll do questions at the end, like I said. And by the way, a lot of the information, well, actually, pretty much all the information I'll be talking about tonight is covered in more detail in two publications. Primarily, there's one called Earned Media, a guide for Move to Amend affiliates, which we'll talk about at the end too, but we'll be sending that out, and I think it probably will be posted online at some point. Is that correct, Caitlin? Okay, well, probably will be posted online. We'll get back to that. And there's another one about framing specifically, because the first document doesn't include framing issues. So there's one called Framing Public Issues by the Frameworks Institute. And I'll return to that, but just rest assured that I'm going to run through a lot of information quickly, but there is more detail available in these documents if you want to, to access it. So first, earned media. What is earned media? Basically, earned media is media that does not cost you money, but you have to earn. And the reason you have to earn it is because somebody else owns the channel of communication. So things like newspaper articles, somebody else owns the newspaper. Television interviews, somebody else owns the show or owns the station. Radio interviews, same thing. And these are contrasted with paid media and owned media. Paid media is just media you pay for, pay somebody else to run, so that's basically advertisements. And owned media is media where you actually own the channel of communication. So your website, your email list, your Twitter, handle, things like that. Earned media can be really helpful to our campaigns. It can be useful for educating the public, swaying elected officials to take a position you would like them to take, recruiting new members, and of course, just generally winning our campaigns. So it's something that it's useful for all of our groups to consider using. I do want to say, though, that you shouldn't use earned media just to use it. It should be part of a broader strategy, specifically a broader communication strategy that itself is based on your broader overarching strategy of what you are trying to do. So first you want to figure out, what are your goals? Who has the power to help you achieve those goals? Are they policymakers? Are they the general public? Are they somebody else? And then what action do you want those people to take? And then you can figure out how to influence them through the media. So it should definitely be part of the bigger strategy. Media is basically communication, so it's not really that strange or exotic or anything, but it is a bit different from talking to a friend or a fellow activist. And one way that it's different is that when we're talking to somebody, whether they're in front of us or over the phone or whatever, we really are just talking to them. If I'm talking to my friend, I'm talking to my friend. With a reporter or a radio host or whatnot, it's a little different because you're talking to that person, but you're also talking through that person to an audience. So it's important to think about who your audience is whenever you go on to a radio show or a television show or talk to a reporter. Try to figure out who they are, their demographics and such like that, but also just on a basic level who they are and how they think. And you want to try to craft your messages with those things in mind. And when you deliver your messages, you want to do so in a way that makes them actually listen to you. And that will often mean, starting from where they are rather than from where you are, for instance. And when you are communicating through the media, by the way, you're not just transferring information. That's, I think, a very common misconception, especially among, I would say, folks on the left, but really folks who work with the media in a volunteer sort of capacity across the spectrum. A lot of times we have a tendency to want to think that we have facts and we have logical arguments, and if we just give people the facts and the logical arguments and the statistics, they will come to the right conclusion and they will be on your side. And that actually is not how people's minds work. So rather than just transferring information, it's helpful to think about actually helping people make sense of the world, because that's what you're doing. So in order to be effective, it's helpful to actually have some idea of how people make sense of the world. I mean, the world's a complicated place, and we all get lots of new information every day. And if we had to start from scratch to try to interpret every piece of information, we wouldn't get anything else done. We just sit around all day probably trying to figure out what to do. So through our evolutionary history, we have developed some shortcuts and some ways to be efficient in how we process information. And psychological research suggests that people do indeed use mental shortcuts. We use them all the time. When we have information incoming, that information brings with it cues about where to file it mentally. So I get a new piece of information and I basically kind of go through my mental file folders and say, okay, where does this fit? And once I figure out where it fits, I put it there. Now, people get most of their information about public issues from the media. And over time, that creates a framework of expectations. In other words, it kind of creates a system of file folders in your head. And people fit incoming information into that framework. And so what a frame is basically that. It's a conceptual structure that helps us to understand new information in terms of stories we already know. It's the place that you put that new piece of information. You can also think of a frame as a lens through which we interpret issues. And that's actually a useful way to think about it, because if you have a different frame, it'll often lead you to a different conclusion. Now, so this is a picture. I'm just going to give an example of framing. I actually can't see the chat box, so Caitlin, are you there? Can you help me out for a second?
Sure, what's up?
Okay. Okay, so people on the other end, what do you guys see here? Like, what do you think the story is? Caitlin, if you could just read off the first, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 responses or whatever. Just tell me what you see.
Nobody's saying anything yet. Come on, folks.
Hopefully I haven't put a
Tracy says the collapse of Iraq. Okay. Saddam being toppled. People jumping up on a statue.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
A statue being taken down.
Do people recognize this scene?
Victory. Obviously. Yeah, it looks like, I mean, yes, many folks know that this is the Saddam Hussein statue in Iraq.
Right. Okay, that's fine then. Yeah, it's a little blurry too, so sorry about that. Yeah, so basically this is the image that a lot of Americans saw, I mean, more or less, on their television screens when that statue of Saddam was toppled. And you basically see a, statue being taken down and a big crowd of Iraqis around, pulling it down with the help of some Marines, right? Now, this is the same scene, but the frame's different. So now, I know it's even blurrier, and my apologies for that, but if you can make out what's going on, what do you see now? Caitlin, are you still there?
The town square. Yeah, the town square, a public square, an unidentifiable square.
Almost unidentifiable. Okay.
An empty square.
An empty square. Yeah, and that's probably the biggest thing is that now I know it's blurry, but yeah, this is the same scene. The statue's in the same place. That little blurry thing by the statue is the crowd of Iraqis. And so you can see that it's actually quite a small crowd. Most of the square is empty. And it looks like they've stopped traffic or something over on the side, probably to keep people that they didn't want in there out. And the whole perimeter is surrounded by U.S. tanks. So you can imagine that if this were the scene that were shown on American televisions, the conclusions that people would have drawn about what was actually happening here and what the meaning of this event was would have been very different, because the frame is different. Frames can be visual. They can also be verbal or just involve words. Some examples are the death tax versus the estate tax, gun safety versus gun control, abortion being murder versus a medical procedure, and freedom fighters versus terrorists. Each of these pairs of words refer to the same thing, but of course, depending on which one you use, people will draw different conclusions. And I think a lot of folks on this webinar probably have noticed how oftentimes if the mainstream media is covering some insurgency in some other country, and we don't like the government there, then those people will be freedom fighters. But if we do like the government there, then they will be terrorists. And so the use of that term is very important. People do react differently depending on how you describe that and which frame you use. So for movement success, it's really important to choose good frames. You want to think about what frame you're using and make sure that it helps people get the right angle on a story and come to the conclusions that you want them to draw, basically. It's also important to contest the opposition's frames, and by that I mean if the opposition is doing its job right, it's going to come up with a different frame that undermines your story. Excuse me. That undermines your story and furthers their own point of view. Excuse me 1 second. Sorry about that. I'm still getting over a little bit of a cold, so hopefully I won't end up coughing. Okay. I think I'm okay. Okay. Yeah, so sorry about that. So contesting the opposition's frames basically means okay. It basically means you want to undermine the other side's frame and show why it is not correct, why it is not relevant, and then you want to offer your own frame, a different frame in its place. Because in our heads, we don't like a vacuum, in terms of frames. So if you undermine somebody else's frame, but you don't offer an alternative, that undermined frame actually kind of lingers in the person's head. So the only way to really reframe is to basically provide a different frame while showing why the other frame is not the best way to look at things. Also, tone is part of the frame. And this is important to realize as well, that you can classify tone into two different categories: a politicized tone and a problem-solving tone. And the politicized tone is basically, it sets up an us versus them dynamic. It reminds people of their hardened positions and political identities, and leads people to ask, what side am I on? So an example is if somebody were to talk about, say, the torture of prisoners under the Bush administration. If they were to start the piece of communication with, we condemn the Bush administration for the torture of prisoners, blah, blah, blah. People that are listening to that are basically going to first hear, we condemn the Bush administration for. They then subconsciously ask themselves, or rather, sorry, they notice first that, okay, they're anti-Bush. Then they ask themselves, am I anti-Bush? And if the answer is yes, then they keep listening, and they are already inclined to agree with whatever you say, because they decided that you're on the same side. If they answer no, then they either change the channel or walk off or stop listening, chances are. So the politicized tone, it's good for rallying your base, but it's not good for actually convincing folks to adopt a new point of view or change their opinion. The problem-solving tone, in contrast, communicates respect and engagement. It basically communicates that we're on the same side and there's a problem that we need to figure out how to solve. So that's the kind of, how do we solve the problem is the question it leads you to. And in the kind of jargon of framing, the politicized tone is also called the rhetorical tone, and the problem-solving tone is called the reasonable tone. I kind of feel like those terms aren't that descriptive, so that's why I'm calling them politicized or problem-solving. But if you come across those terms elsewhere, that's what those mean. Also, stories just in general are really, really important. I mean, people have been telling stories to each other for a long, long time, millennia, probably longer than millennia. There's a reason why in a lot of cultures before there was, written language, the history of the people was passed down through a verbal storytelling tradition. There's also a reason why we have things like fairy tales, which in many cases are structured to communicate a moral lesson to children. So we try to, instruct them to adopt a certain moral position through stories. And the reason these things work, and the reason that we do this, is that we are just naturally inclined as human beings to notice and remember information and share it if it's presented as a story, much more than if it's just presented as a string of facts and figures and statistics. So when I say a story, I don't mean, of course, that you have to, start every press release with once upon a time in a far off land, blah, blah, blah. What I mean is that you want to think of the elements of narrative, and that means context, who's the protagonist, which is the good guy, or good gal, or gals, or whatever. Who's the antagonist, or the bad guy? What is the conflict, and what's the resolution to the conflict? So one potential kind of overreaching story we could tell about our own issue is, the context could include Citizens United and a lot of money in elections and the outcomes of that. Protagonist could be, the American people, or a certain subset of the American people. The antagonist could be big corporations or big government, depending on which side of the divide, the sort of political divide you may be on. The conflict is between the protagonist and the antagonist, and the resolution may be the passage of a constitutional amendment. Now, you can also tell a lot of other stories with, with a different resolution or different context, like a story in a local area might include the passage of an actual resolution as the resolution. And of course, emotional impact is really important in storytelling. If you are listening to a story or watching a movie or what have you, and there's no emotional connection, then you probably are going to stop listening pretty quickly. So you want to try to get a bit of emotional kick in there. One way is to help your audience identify with the protagonist. So that might mean talking about how similar, how it is, like, say, the American people, how, the audience is basically part of that protagonist. It could mean talking about individual people who are, say, fighting the good fight and talking about their individual experiences. Or it could be done in other ways. Also, appealing to moral values that people already hold is a pretty good way to get an emotional impact, because we all have our kind of values that if you bring them up in the right way, we get all misty-eyed. Whether it's democracy or it's freedom or it's family values or whatever, these things are deeply held and important, and people do have emotional responses to them. And finally, any story you tell, of course, should fit within your chosen frame. And the frame itself is a sort of story, but stories, the category of stories is broader. It's something that there are little stories and big stories and all kinds of stories. But whatever story you tell, you want to make sure that's consistent with how you're trying to frame things. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about kind of the nuts and bolts of how you can actually work with the media. So first, reporters are really important. You're going to need to work with them, chances are. So it's important to think about what they want. And they're not a foreign species or some kind of, really exotic creature. I mean, reporters are people with jobs, and they're trying to get their job done. They're trying to do their job well. So what they generally want are good stories presented in a way that makes their jobs easier. If you can give them that, you both win. So in a sense, you're on the same side. Not 100%, but you have similar objectives. And reporters also compete hard for space in the paper, and they're increasingly harried because of downsizing. Over the last few years, the newspaper industry has really cut a lot of staff. A lot of reporters have lost their jobs. If you walk into the newsroom of just about any local or regional paper at this point, you'll see a lot of empty desks. It's kind of depressing, actually, sometimes. But the result of that is that the reporters who are left are even busier than reporters used to be. So they're busy and don't appreciate having their time wasted. So reporters basically want a resource. They are not your enemy. You're not going to go in there and have to fight with the reporter to get your story in the paper. They're not your enemy. You should be trying to work together, but they're also not your friend. And it's important to remember that because you don't want to tell anything to a reporter that you don't want to see in the paper potentially. So this whole this is off the record thing that appears a lot in movies where that line comes up, but in practice it's good to just always assume everything's on the record, and then you won't run into problems. So it's good to build relationships with a handful of important reporters who are the people that are most likely to cover your story. Beat reporters generally at newspapers are going to be your most important contacts. There are other categories of people you might also want to consider building relationships with, like bloggers and editors of newspapers and others. But beat reporters are really important, and here's why. First off, newspapers still lead the news in the sense that other media tends to follow their lead. So radio and television in the blogosphere tend to take a lot of their cues from the news media. So they tend to break things. Also, in terms of beat reporters are the people who have an existing area, like local politics or fashion or food or whatever it is, and they write stories. They go out and find stories on that area. And then they bring the story back to their editor and say, hey, I've got this great story, I think it should be in the paper, and then they have to sell the editor on it. They're important because they tend to be the better reporters and get the bigger stories in the paper. And so beat reporters are important. They also tend to produce the most copy, which is the most actual text in the paper. The other alternative is that an editor can assign a story to a reporter. So that's kind of the alternative. There's beat reporters who, on their own enterprise, go out and get a story, or the editor can assign. But basically, beat reporters are going to be really important to you generally. So no matter who you're considering building a relationship with, of course, it's first important to identify the individual, and to do that you need to do some background research, figure out what they've written, what kind of area they cover, maybe some personal stuff if you can get it, get an idea of who they are and whether you actually want to take the time to try to build a relationship. If you decide, yes, I do, ask them to meet at their office or over coffee, explain your issue to them, and offer yourself as a resource. And that part is actually pretty important. I assume a lot of folks on this webinar probably have some organizing experience. Probably not all of you, but I'm guessing a good number of you do. And if you have organizing experience, you probably know that organizing works much better if you speak in terms of the other person's interests rather than in terms of your interests. So if you're trying to get somebody to come to a rally, you don't say, oh, I'm having a rally and I really want you to come to my rally. It's important to me. You want to say, we have this issue that we're fighting and we're all in this together and the rally's going to be really cool and you're going to enjoy it and whatever. So the same thing goes for reporters. You want to, basically talk to the reporter with their interests in mind, offer yourself as a resource, try to, see if you can be of use to them. And then you build a relationship. And the best way to do that is to consistently offer them good material. Now, in terms of what is good material, stories that are newsworthy is the quick answer. But just because it interests you does not mean that it's news. And that seems obvious, but a lot of people say they'll have a fundraiser or something, and they've worked really hard on it, and they've got a band lined up, and they've got, the whole thing planned out, and they're really excited about it. And then they try to get a reporter interested, and the reporter is like, well, why should I care about that? Because just because it interests you, it's not necessarily news. Something's news value or newsworthiness can be classified into like 7 different categories. And if you're trying to figure out whether something actually is potentially news, it's useful to put these categories down onto a sheet of paper and rate your story in every one of them. You can give it like 1 to 5 stars in every category and see if it scores highly in any of them. So the categories are conflict, which I think is probably pretty obvious, novelty, which means how new something is or how big, like it's the biggest, it's the best, it's the newest, it's whatever. Timeliness means it's happening right now or just happened. Proximity is how close it is to your audience, and that might mean geographically or it might mean in other ways. Prominence means how prominent the individuals that are involved in the story are, or the organizations for that matter. But for instance, if the president's daughter has a birthday party, that may be news. If your daughter has a birthday party, it probably isn't news. Impact is how many people are affected, and human interest is this kind of emotional reaction we get to hearing about the experiences and struggles of other people and lost dogs and things like that. So if your story does not score highly in at least a couple of these, it's probably not newsworthy. And after you've ranked your story in each of these categories, you can actually try to increase its rankings by retelling the story, focusing a little more on where you got the most stars or where you think you can get more stars. So if it's say the first major city to pass a resolution like Los Angeles recently did, you probably want to focus on that novelty component, and maybe retell the story more from that novelty component. Or if it's something that happened just in connection with your local elections and it's really important in the local area, you might want to emphasize that it's something that is going to directly impact the lives of people, living where you live. 3 other concepts in addition to news value are useful when you're trying to figure out whether something's newsworthy and make it more newsworthy. The angle is just what's emphasized. Easiest way to kind of figure out a good angle is to do those rankings that I just talked about, and then focus on the news value categories that have the highest rankings. Your peg is something that makes your story timely. So some stories are by their nature timely, like it's something like a resolution that just got passed, but most of them aren't. If you want to just tell a story about money and politics and why that's a problem, something like that, you'll need to peg it to something. And you may want to peg it to an upcoming election. You may want to peg it to, say, the Citizens United anniversary. You may want to peg it to something else. But something that is current, you want to basically introduce it at the beginning of your story and say, this such and such is happening, and my story is related in X or Y way. And then finally, the hook. And the hook is basically, it's a little harder to define, but it basically grabs the audience's attention. It's something that usually appears at the beginning of a story and gets your attention. And it could be practically anything. It might be a nice quote, it might be a shocking statistic, it might be just sort of a visual, rather a mental image that's just really powerful. It could even be a picture or something like that. So it's something that grabs the audience's attention and also is something that usually when you think back on the story later, or if you remember it, you'll tend to remember the hook. So in that sense, it's sort of like a jingle in a television commercial where the jingle itself isn't really important, but it sort of encapsulates that television commercial for you. And if you hear the jingle, you think of the product or the brand or whatever. Right. So say you've got a story now, and you think it's something that's newsworthy. How do you get it to the reporter? Press releases and press advisories are 2 good and standard sort of ways to get news to reporters. A press release basically alerts a reporter to a story, and it gives enough information for the reporter to write an article, but it also gives contact information for one or more contacts from your organization to give more depth. So it's basically a way to get a reporter the outline of a story. And reporters, being as busy as they are, sometimes will kind of cut and paste portions even from the press release if they don't have enough time. So it's important to make sure that whatever you send out as a press release is well written and no typos and such. Also, they'll take it more seriously if it looks professional. So it's important to proofread it. Press advisories are similar, but they alert reporters to events. So they basically should give enough information to get the reporter interested and intrigued and wanting to come to your event, and then should answer who, what, when, where, and why so that they can come. There are best practices for formatting and sending press releases and advisories. I am not going to go into those here now, but in that earned media document I mentioned, they are outlined. So I encourage you to look there. But there are definitely ways to send these things that are more effective than others. Whenever you send a release or an advisory, one thing that is really important is to follow it up with a pitch call. And what a pitch call is basically after you send the thing, whatever it is, you call the reporter and you basically say, hi, I'm such and such with such and such organization, and we're having a rally in a week and a half or whatever. You tell them about it a little bit and say, hey, did you get my advisory that I just sent you? And make sure that they got it. You can offer to resend it if they didn't. So it's basically a way to get their attention and convince them to cover the story or event. And a lot of folks don't do this. A lot of folks will just send the release or the advisory and then assume that their work is done, and then they'll wonder why they didn't get any media coverage. And one reason is probably because they didn't do the pitch call, because otherwise it's very easy for a reporter who gets a lot of these things in their inbox to just take one quick glance at your whatever you sent and move on to the next one. So when you're talking to reporters, it's useful to think in terms of what the format is that they actually are going to use in transmitting your message, if they do. The average newspaper quote is only 30 words long, and the average TV clip is about 10 seconds. And these constraints have led to the modern phenomenon of sound bites, which have their ups and downs. I mean, they're irritating sometimes that we have to kind of live in a soundbite world, but that's how it is. And if you want to get your quotes into the paper or on the radio or on TV, it's useful to be able to package your message, at least parts of your message, in sound bites. And to do this, one way is to use the 2793 formula, which just means no more than 27 words, 9 seconds, and 3 points. So if you prepare your certain sound bites in advance, and practice them and get them so that you can easily say them, it's more likely that will end up in the paper or what have you. Another thing about messaging that's important to realize is that most people don't live in your world, in the sense that they don't live and breathe your issue like you probably do. So even though you may start feeling like you're saying the same thing over and over, like a broken record. You say, oh my goodness, we just had that radio interview yesterday on this station and one the day before on this other station, and we've had 3 newspaper articles in different newspapers, and all of them have said pretty much the same thing, and people must be tired of hearing about this. We should change our message and make it new and exciting again. Most people have not heard your message yet, because most people are not looking at every single piece of media you get out there. And even if they do, it'll take a while for it to sink in. In general, as a rule of thumb, it takes about 6 exposures for your average person to even notice your message. So it really is important to just keep repeating that message so it'll actually get through. Even if you sound like a broken record, don't worry about it. Just keep getting that message out there. Also, it's important to keep the message consistent. Part of the reason, of course, is that in order to repeat a message, you have to actually say basically the same thing, otherwise it's not repeating. But also, if you have different people talking in the media and they say things that are actually in conflict, that can create problems for you later on. That's something your opposition could use against you potentially, or it may just come out as looking sloppy. So you do want to try to keep your message consistent. That means, it means coordinating between the people that are going to be talking to the media. So it's a good idea to select some spokespeople. This might be a very small group, like 1 or 2 people. It may be a bigger group. that's your choice. But select who is actually going to talk to the media, and then coordinate between them. Try to get on the same page about the issues and general responses. Also, it's really good to develop some talking points in an FAQ so that people have something in writing they can refer to and practice with. And then you do want to practice, do some role plays, try having one person play the reporter and the other person play the spokesperson, and, grill them or whatever. It's also, of course, once you get an interview, important to be able to stay on message. And this is something that is not natural. It's something that needs to be learned, and spokespeople should spend some time trying to learn it. It's pretty important. So one thing is you don't want to allow the reporter to lead you off topic. If they do that, if they start going off into left field somewhere, just say something like, I'd be happy to talk about that, but first I'd like to explain how, blah, blah, blah. And you really don't necessarily ever have to go back to that thing unless the reporter takes you back there, so that's kind of a way of redirecting things. Also, you don't need to wait for a question to be asked in order to answer it. If you're going into an interview and you're trying to get a particular message out, kind of, sketch out the main couple of points you want to make and make sure that you get to them. And if the reporter does not ask you the appropriate question or does not ask you soon enough, you can say something similar. I'd be happy to talk about that, but let me first, whatever. And also, it's important not to repeat a negative. This goes back to the framing discussion that we were having earlier. Basically, if you have, say, a reporter that says, I heard that you beat your wife. Is that true? You don't want to say, no, of course I don't beat my wife. I love my wife. Because what you've just done is, even though you were trying to, basically set the record straight, you just solidified that association between wife beating and you in the audience's mind. Subconsciously, but you just did that. So instead, you want to neutralize it with a positive statement. You could say something like, well, actually, my wife and I have a very good relationship, and we love each other very much. And that's just that frame, because if you strengthen a frame, if you repeat a negative frame, any frame really, it strengthens that frame in the audience's mind. Okay, also, you don't have to answer every question. This is probably the hardest thing for new spokespeople to learn, because it goes against all of our just general politeness instincts. In a regular conversation, you feel like you'd be rude if you didn't answer a question that was posed, usually. But when you're talking to a reporter in an interview, it is a different situation. It is not expected you answer every question. The reporter expects that if you are, doing your job well, that you will stay on message and you will work to stay on message. So you don't have to answer every question. Now, that does not mean that you should just go mute and not say anything, of course. What you want to do is you want to respond, not answer, respond. And the way you respond to a negative question is by using a pivot. And what a pivot is basically something verbally that just allows you to go from where you are, which is being faced with a negative question, and pivot gracefully to a good place, which is your message. So a pivot has a formula. It's basically a pivot phrase plus a talking point. Pivot phrases are things like the following. There's other ones as well, of course. The thing is, the real issue is, what it sounds like you're really getting at is, that's an interesting question, but first I'd like to address those kinds of things. And then your talking point. And this is actually another reason why having your talking points ready to go and knowing them is important, because then you can just kind of whip them out as you need them. For example, say the reporter asks you, do you really think voters will take this seriously? You might say something like, well, what it sounds like you're really getting at is whether corporate power is a problem in our country. I think we can all agree that government should serve we the people, not we the corporations. Or if the reporter says, is this some kind of socialist plot? You can say, the reality is that Americans across the political spectrum agree on this. We need to amend the Constitution to reclaim our democracy. And by the way, now if you're talking to, if you're being recorded and you might end up in like a radio or television clip, it's useful if you can actually kind of pause a little bit between your pivot phrase and your talking point, because that means that they can cut you right before your talking point and just get the talking point. So you could say something like, the reality is that Americans across the political spectrum agree on this, blah, blah, blah. Now, there are a few other ways to get something into the paper besides just through reporters and news articles. There are 3 different types of opinion pieces that are very useful to be aware of and to know how to use. One is a letter to the editor. These are probably familiar to most people who are watching this webinar. They're the little letters submitted by readers, short little pieces that appear in the paper or in magazines or other types of things that take letters to the editor. They usually respond to a current topic, often to a previous article or something like that. And what happens is that as letters are submitted, the editor will go through all of them. We'll read all of the letters and then try to select letters that represent the bulk of kind of the public opinion that's coming in. At least that's what they're supposed to do. I think that's usually what people do. So basically, if you have a bunch of people submit a letter talking about the same thing and making the same points, it's much more likely that you will get a letter, maybe even a couple of letters in the paper than if you just have one person submit a really good letter. An op-ed is short for opposite the editorial page. This is a longer opinion piece that is written by someone that is not on the editorial board of the paper. And it's often signed by an expert or a public figure. Not always, but often. And that will depend a bit on how, what level paper you're trying to get something into. If it's your local community paper that just serves your local area, you may very well get an op-ed in if you're a high school student or you're an elementary school teacher or whatever. But if you're trying to get something into the San Francisco Chronicle or the New York Times, you'll probably need some kind of a qualification to get something published. That doesn't mean that you have to throw up your hands and give up if you don't happen to have somebody in your group who has that kind of qualification. You can ask other people to submit letters. You can even help them draft them if you want to, and then have them submit it. So that is an option. Finally, you have editorials. Editorials are really powerful if you can get them. It is actually a statement by a paper's editorial board. If you can get a paper to basically endorse your upcoming resolution that's going to be on the ballot or whatever, that carries a lot of weight with that paper's readers. In order to get an editorial, generally speaking, you'll need to meet with the editorial board to make your case to them. You might also be able to get one if one of the editors on the editorial board decides that they want an editorial and they take up the cause, but generally speaking, it's good to schedule a meeting with them. And the outcome of that hopefully will be editorial in favor of your position. They also may take no position or kick the story to a reporter, or they may even decide to publish an editorial opposing your position. So it's something that you want to think about these things before you approach an editorial board. What are your chances of success and whether it's worth it. But if you can get it, this can be really good. So moving on, radio interviews. Radio interviews are of course useful. A lot of people listen to the radio, especially during drive time, but at all times really. And so it's useful to try to think whether you can get some radio spots to get your message out there. If you've got an interview on a radio station, like a longer type interview, I'm thinking if it's a soundbite, that sort of fits in the previous stuff we were talking about, where that's just an interview with a reporter. But if you've got, say, 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 30 minutes or something like that to talk about your issue, it's important to prepare before you go in to give the interview. You want to practice whatever it is that you're going to try to say. Go over your message, make sure you know what you're trying to say, practice those talking points and FAQs. Also, you can bring your documents along to the interview. That is one really nice thing about radio, is that you can look at your notes and people will not see you looking at your notes. So feel free to bring them along. Try not to rustle papers or type really loudly while you're in there, but you can bring them along. Also, in general on radio, you want your voice, it's important to think how your voice is going to sound, because it's not just what you say, but it's how you say it and it's how you sound. So you want to sound close to the listener and friendly. You don't want to sound distant. So because of that, things like the quality of basically the audio equipment is important. So if you can be in the studio, that's better than being on the telephone generally. Sometimes you can't help it being on the telephone, but try to be in the studio. And if you have to be on the telephone, it's better to be on a landline than a cell phone. And it's good to be somewhere where you don't have a lot of background noise. Also, speakerphone, don't use a speakerphone because it'll just make your voice sound hollow and distant and cold. During the interview, make sure to repeat your main messages often, because remember how people listen to radio. They'll tune in and they'll tune out a lot. So if you have a half-hour interview and at the very beginning you say your main message and then you go on for the next 25 minutes building the case for what you want people to do or conclude or whatever, most people by the end will have no idea what you're talking about. So if you can repeat your main messages every 5 minutes or so, that's good. Also, if you are trying to get people to say visit your website, it's good to mention the URL pretty frequently and the organization's name. Also, speak slowly and clearly. As you may be able to tell, this is the one that I have the most trouble with. But try to speak slowly and clearly, and smile. Smiling is important because when you smile, your voice sounds more friendly. So even if you're sitting in your office by yourself on the phone, it's still a good idea to smile. And if it's talk radio, if people are able to call in, line up people to call in. Have people call in and make additional points, or just speak in favor, in favor of what you're talking about. That helps show that there's community support for what you're saying, as well as it can make it more, or rather less likely that other people will call in that want to go off into left field about something else, or even want to call in and be hostile. And finally, it's a good idea to listen to your interview afterwards and learn from it. If you can't get a clip off of the radio's website, ask them whether you can get a copy and listen to it. And that's generally uncomfortable for most people, at least at first, to kind of have to hear themselves. But it's really, really useful because then you do notice what you're doing well and what you can improve on. Television interviews, also, it's important to prepare. Surprise. And when you do that, you want to pay special attention to sound bites because television in general is a much more compact medium than radio. Things happen in shorter chunks. So it's extra important to get those sound bites kind of, in there so that they can be used. Also, your clothing and appearance actually do matter because people can see you, so make sure you're well groomed and that your clothing is appropriate. And of course, you can't look at your notes, so don't bring them along, or at least don't have them in front of the camera. During the interview, try to be still. We all not all, but most of us in everyday life have a lot of little extraneous motions that we do. Like right now, I'm sitting here on the stool and I'm swinging back and forth, and I'm probably doing several other things I'm not even aware of. It's a good idea when you're in front of a camera to not do that kind of stuff. And for instance, if somebody is talking to you, normally we tend to nod often to kind of show that we're listening and that we agree, or at least we're listening. On television, that doesn't look very good because you'll see one person talking and you'll see the other person's head bobbing up and down and up and down and up and down. So it's better to just keep your head steady and smile. And even if you are discussing something serious, it's good to have at least a little bit of a half smile on your face because otherwise you tend to look cold. So try to keep some sort of smile on your face. Also, watching your interview afterwards is, of course, a good idea, just like for radio. Okay, and I believe this is the last slide, so just hang tight and we'll get to questions. If a reporter calls you, this is most likely to happen in the afternoon or early evening because that's when reporters are typically working under deadline. And it's also most likely to happen from somebody that you have a relationship with, but it might not. It depends on who you are, and it depends on, what the issue is. Also, and how many calls you're getting from reporters. If there's a hot issue out there, you might be getting a lot of calls from a lot of different reporters you don't know. Anyhow, though, whoever calls you, when you get the call, ask the person what the story is about. If you don't know who they are, recognize, immediately kind of what news outlet they're from, feel free to ask to clarify that as well. Decide if you're willing to talk. You're not under an obligation to talk. You can decide. Oh, I almost made it. Hold on a second. I'm gonna take some more water. Stop coughing. Okay, sorry. If you're willing to talk, you can say that you're in the middle of something and you'll call them back in 5 or 10 minutes. And that's generally a good idea because then you can compose your thoughts and call them back when you're ready. If you get a voicemail from a reporter, return the call promptly because you should remember that the reporter is probably working under a deadline and it may be more convenient for you to call them back tomorrow, but if you do that, they will probably have written the story without you. So do kind of realize the constraints that they're working under and act appropriately. Okay, that's the last of the substantive information. These are the two documents that I mentioned. The first is Earn Media, a guide to Move Command affiliates, which I think is going to be, Caitlin, are you listening? Will be emailed out, I think, and will this be posted online somewhere as well? Okay. Okay, well, I think it's going to be posted somewhere online. Watch the affiliates listserv for that, I suppose. And then framing public issues is the second one. And
sorry, Kaya. I had put myself on mute, and then it turned off my whole thing. So yes, I can post it right next to the webinar recording.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Caitlin. I assumed that, but I had a second there where I was afraid that this whole thing that I was talking to myself was the last 45 minutes. So I'm glad that you're still there, and hopefully everybody else is still there as well. Okay, great. So that's the first thing, and like I said, that covers everything I just talked about except for framing. For the framing material, if you want more information, Framing Public Issues is a good resource, I think. And Caitlin, I'll email it to you or I can email it to the list directly, so people can have that on hand as well. And also that was produced by the Frameworks Institute, and they have a website with other useful materials. So if you're interested in the framing stuff, I'd encourage you to check that out. All right, a couple final notes. Hang on until the question period is done, if you could, because you will then be directed to a survey at the end of the webinar, and your comments are really important for us to figure out what's useful, what was useful, what not so useful, how to improve things. So it'd be really great if you can complete the survey. The next webinar will be the first Tuesday of next month. That is January 3rd, and it'll be at the same time. And the topic will be putting a Move to Amend resolution on your local ballot. And finally, if you have any questions, of course, feel free to contact Move to Amend. You can use that email address there or that phone number, or also there is a contact us form on the website, which is always easy to find. So that's all I've got, and we can go to questions.